live to you today from Jekylls Laboratory. Last night it ended with them discovering Hyde's corpse inside the cabinet and also 3 items. The first item was a will that had been changed from being addressed to Hyde to now being addressed to Utterson. So Jekyll had rewritten his will, leaving everything to Utterson. The second item was a note from Jekyll instructing Utterson to open the letter that was given to him by Lanyon. Remember, Utterson kept that locked away in his safe, as he was told not to only to open it in case of the disappearance of Jekyll. Jekyll now having disappeared, so off he's going home to open that. And then lastly, a final enclosure, which was very well wrapped up, very well hidden. Presumably, this enclosure holds the key to this whole mystery. But as ever, Stevenson makes really clever use of form and structure to help build tension here and maintain the high level of suspense we've had right throughout the novella. What this chapter also poses is a further obstacle in the narrative, a further obstacle in the unfolding of this mystery. So whereas we want to know really what happened to Jekyll, why is Hyde lying there dead, what is in this further secret enclosure, what's in there. But then what we're having to do is to follow Utterson back to his home to read a further letter from Lanyon. So what's happening there is, in terms of structure, quite a few things are happening. So you've got a shift in location. So we've gone away from the cabinet, from this really dramatic and mysterious event that we want to try and understand. We've shifted away from there back to Utterson's home. And secondly, we've shifted in time because, remember, Lanyon's dead. So we are now shifting back in time to a time when he was still alive and when he wrote this letter. So again, a further obstacle to getting to the crux of this mystery. This whole chapter is a letter from Lanyon that within it contains a letter from Jekyll. It's a letter within a letter. And again, it's the epistolary form of the novella, that it's written in letters. It's this that makes the narrative so fragmented. It's this that creates enigma for the reader, because we're getting this variety of singular perspectives that we try to cross-reference, we try to correlate it all together to make sense of it. So Stevenson is manipulating here form and structure in a way that really helps to further build tension, and hence we keep reading. So I'll start reading this then. And this is Lanyon speaking, remember, but within the chapter he's going to refer to a further letter from Jekyll that he received. On the 9th of January, now 4 days ago, so again we're going further back in time, I received by the evening delivery a registered envelope addressed in the hand of my colleague and old school companion, Henry Jekyll. I was a good deal surprised by this, for we were by no means in the habit of correspondence. I'd seen the man, dined with him indeed the night before, and I could imagine nothing in our intercourse that should justify the formality of registration. The contents increased my wonder, for this is how the letter ran. 10th of December, 1800 something. Dear Lanyon, you are one of my oldest friends, and although we have differed at times on scientific questions, I cannot remember, at least on my side, any break in our affection. The relationship of between Lanyon and Jekyll, you could argue, is very much a microcosm for the conflict that was going on within scientific thought at the time. So we know that the 19th century had been a time of great advancement in terms of science and medicine. We know that new sciences were developing, pseudosciences that were perceived as less credible than science proper. So there were a lot of tensions there within the scientific world. And there was a growing understanding that science as it stood could not sufficiently explain reality. There were questions left that still needed posing. There was still work to be done in science, things to be explored and experimented. So remember Lanyon, Jekyll saw him as this kind of hidebound pedant. So that means hidebound, he's like overly traditional. A pedant means he's a stickler full of rules, just all about convention. And he criticised Lanyon for that. Jekyll is very much a bastion for experimental science, trying new things. So to him, the type of science that Lanyon represents, that very rational, material, traditional type of science that believes there's a rational explanation for everything, all phenomenon can be explained in rational terms. Jekyll sees that as very narrow-minded, hence why he's experimenting. And then, on the other hand, you had Lanyon criticising the type of more experimental science that Jekyll represents, criticising that, calling it unscientific balderdash, so absolute rubbish, it's not science. There was never a day when if you had said to me, Jekyll, my life, my honour, my reason depend upon you, I would not have sacrificed my fortune or my left hand to help you. Lanyon, my life, my honour, my reason are all at your mercy. If you fail me tonight, I am lost. You might suppose after this preface that I'm going to ask you for something dishonourable to grant. Judge for yourself. I want you to postpone all other engagements for tonight. Even if you were summoned to the bedside of an emperor to take a cab, unless your carriage should be actually at the door, and with this letter in your hand for consultation to drive straight to my house. Paul, my butler, has his orders. You'll find him waiting your arrival with the locksmith. The door of my cabinet is then to be forced. We've already talked about the door, the symbolism of the door, the fact that Jekyll is now inviting Lanyon to break down that door. Potentially this reflects the way in which Lanyon is now being allowed inside, is now being allowed to see Jekyll for who he really is, being allowed to see past the facade to what Jekyll is truly about. And you're to go in alone, to open the glazed press, letter E, on the left hand, breaking the lock if it be shut, and to draw out with all its contents as they stand, the fourth drawer from the top, or which is the same thing, the third from the bottom. In my extreme distress of mind, I have a morbid fear of misdirecting you, but even if I am in error, you may know the right drawer by its contents. Some powders, a vial and a paper book. This drawer I beg of you to carry back with you to Cavendish Square exactly as it stands. That is the first part of the service. Now for the second. You should be back, if you set out at once on the receipt of this, long before midnight. But I will leave you that amount of margin, not only in the fear of those obstacles that can neither be prevented nor foreseen, but because an hour when your servants are in bed is to be preferred for what will then remain to do. Lanyon here is being encouraged to collude in something a bit underhand, again, to be very secretive. The mention of midnight as well is very ominous. It's archetypal of Gothic literature as well. And midnight, that's when you have the cover of night, that's when people can get up to no good. Also, and you'll notice that Hyde, much of the hour of midnight is also quite consistently associated with Hyde and his wrongdoings and his crimes. At midnight then, I have to ask you to be alone in your consulting room, to admit with your own hand into the house a man who will present himself in my name, and to place in his hands the drawer that you will have brought with you from my cabinet. So a man, again withholding information, a further enigma. Who is this man? Then you will have played your part and earned my gratitude completely. 5 minutes afterwards, if you insist upon an explanation, you will have understood that these arrangements are of capital importance, and that by the neglect of one of them, fantastic as they must appear, you might have charged your conscience with my death or the shipwreck of my reason. Confident as I am that you will not trifle with this appeal, my heart sinks and my hand trembles at the bare thought of such a possibility. So he's saying, thinking about Lanyon not doing this for him, his heart sinks, his hand trembles. So extremes of emotion again, very archetypal of Gothic literature. Think of me at this hour, in a strange place, labouring under a blackness of distress. That metaphor there, it's like his life has become totally subsumed now in darkness and evil, that no fancy can exaggerate. And yet well aware that, if you will but punctually serve me, my troubles will roll away like a story that is told. Serve me, my dear Lanyon, and save your friend, Henry Jekyll. P.S. I had already sealed this up when a fresh terror struck upon my soul. It is possible that the post office may fail me, and this letter not come into your hands until tomorrow morning. In that case, dear Lanyon, do my errand when it shall be most convenient for you in the course of the day, and once more expect my messenger at midnight. It may then already be too late, and if that night passes without event, you will know that you have seen the last of Henry Jekyll. Upon the reading of this letter, I made sure my colleague was insane, so Lanyon's only rational explanation for Jekylls Letter, Jekylls very strange and fantastic requests, his only rational explanation is that at this point is that he's insane. Because in his mind there is no rational explanation possible at all for Jekyll's behaviour. But till that was proved beyond the possibility of doubt, I felt bound to do as he requested. So again, Lanyon's another soul who needs proof of things. He needs material evidence. He is all about objective thinking, rationale, and he represents that branch of science, that branch of thinkers who believe logic and reason can explain away everything. The less I understood of this far ago, the less I was in a position to judge of its importance. An appeal so worded could not be set aside without a grave responsibility. So he's thinking, I've got to do this. I rose accordingly from table, got into a hansom, so into a cab, and drove straight to Jekyll's house. The butler was awaiting my arrival. He had received by the same post as mine a registered letter of instruction, and had sent at once for a locksmith and a carpenter. The tradesmen came while we were yet speaking, and we moved in a body to old Denman's surgical theatre. That mention of the surgical theatre again just creates a really eerie and unsettling atmosphere for what's to come, from which, as you are doubtless aware, Jekyll's private cabinet is most conveniently entered. The door was very strong, the lock excellent. Again, you can mention the use of the objective correlative, that this door as an object correlates with Jekyll's very deeply kept, deeply guarded secrets. The door is very strong, relates to how Jekyll's true inner nature is very strongly guarded. The lock's excellent, so nobody's getting in. Nobody is really able to see the true Jekyll. It suggests he is a very restrained man. It shows his kind of extreme self-restraint that goes into maintaining the reputation that he wants to have in society. The carpenter avowed he would have great trouble and have to do much damage if force were to be used, and the locksmith was near despair. But this was a handy fellow, and after 2 hours' work the door stood open. The press marked E was unlocked, and I took out the drawer, had it filled up with straw and tied in a sheet, and returned it with it to Cavendish Square. Here I proceeded to examine its contents. The powders were neatly enough made up, but not with the nicety of the dispensing chemist, so that it was plain they were of Jekyll's private manufacture. And when I opened one of the wrappers, I found what seemed to me a simple crystalline salt of white colour. Lanyon's approach immediately is to try and make sense of this he's taken a very clinical approach, and he's using scientific language when he talks about what's there. So he talks about crystalline salt, powders, etc. But the fact that he can't name what's in front of him shows you, first of all, that whatever Jekyll is doing diverges from scientific norms, established norms in science at the time and in medicine. The vial, again another scientific term, to which I next turned my attention, might have been about half full of a blood red liquor. Interesting here, so blood red, the mention of red, again it's been mentioned before with the red baize of the door, for instance. The mention of red is very ominous, connotes violence, danger, bloodshed. Liquor, potentially, liquor is something that can make a human being lose control or loosen their inhibitions. So that hints towards what this medicine is very likely doing. It's allowing Jekyll to lose control, lose all of his inhibition, which was highly pungent to the sense of smell and seemed to me contain phosphorus and some volatile ether. At the other ingredients I could make no guess. The book was an ordinary version book and contained little but a series of dates. These covered a period of many years, but I observed that the entries ceased nearly a year ago, and quite abruptly. Here and there a brief remark was appended to a date, usually no more than a single word, double, occurring perhaps 6 times in a total of 700 entries, and once very early in the list, and followed by several marks of exclamation. Total failure. All this, though it whetted my curiosity, told me little that was definite. There was a vial of some tincture, a paper of some salt, and the record of a series of experiments that had led, like too many of Jekyll's investigations, to no end of practical usefulness. Because to him, to Lanyon, that's what science is about. It's about science needs to be useful, it has to have practical application. That's all he's interested in. How could the presence of these articles in my house affect either the honour, the sanity, or the life of my flighty colleague? If his messenger could go to one place, why could he not go to another? And even granting some impediment, why was this gentleman to be received by me in secret? You've got there a long list of rhetorical questions. This allows us as readers to share in Lanyon's confusion at this stage. The more I reflected, the more convinced I grew that I was dealing with a case of cerebral disease. That's the only conclusion he can come to here. He must be mad, he must have some disease of the brain, because none of this makes sense. And for Lanyon, everything must necessarily make sense. Everything does make sense in his mind and his way of seeing the world. But it could well be a comment from Stevenson on the short-sightedness of that view, of believing that everything makes sense and there's an explanation for everything. Stevenson's very arguably putting forward the idea that that's a very insufficient and inadequate way of viewing our reality. That there are certain unknowable things and inexplicable phenomena that we are yet to be able to understand or make sense of in human terms. I dismissed my servants to bed. I loaded an old revolver that I might be found in some posture of self-defence. Very ominous that he's loading a gun now, foreshadowing frightening events ahead. 12 o'clock had scarce rung out over London, so it's midnight. The time where supernatural things come out to play, at the time when people get up to no good. Ere the knocker sounded very gently on the door. We've heard about Hyde being light-footed. Here he is knocking very gently on the door. Hyde is that part of ourselves that wants to be neither seen nor heard, wants to go unnoticed, to not be judged. Hence why he's being very gentle there on the door, very secretive. Wanting to remain as covert as possible. I went myself at the summons and found a small man crouching against the pillars of the portico. There's real dramatic irony going on here. So remember, dramatic irony is when we, as readers, know more than the characters within the story. So we've definitely put the dots together by now that this small man is Hyde, whereas Lanyon doesn't know who he is, and that's only serves to further build tension and suspense as we await his realisation. "Are you come from Dr. Jekyll?" I asked. He told me yes, by a constrained gesture, and when I had bidden him enter, he did not obey me without a searching backward glance into the darkness of the square. Hyde looking back there, back into the square, indicates his paranoia, the fact that he's on the run. There was a policeman not far off, advancing with his bull's-eye open, and at the sight I thought my visitor started and made greater haste. These particulars struck me, I confess, disagreeably, and as I followed him into the bright light of the consulting room, I kept my hand ready on my weapon. Here, at last, I had a chance of clearly seeing him. I had never set eyes on him before, so much was certain. He was small, as I have said. We've talked about why Hyde's small, arguably because Hyde is the part of ourselves that we suppress, we push down, we refuse to allow to develop and to grow, so hence Hyde's smallness. I was struck besides with the shocking expression of his face, with his remarkable combination of great muscular activity and great apparent debility of constitution. Again, Hyde is this living contradiction, this paradox. He's just not right. He defies rational explanation. His face, on the one hand, is very animated and the muscles all moving, but then at the same time he looks really weak and that he has no strength in him. All of these this paradoxical information about him, the idea that he seems small and big at the same time, further reinforces the idea of him as a supernatural being. And last but not least, with the old subjective disturbance caused by his neighbourhood. So here's Lanyon as well, another character, acknowledging that when you're in his neighbourhood, so when you're beside Hyde, when you're near him, you feel a subjective disturbance. Interesting use of the word subjective. So maybe this here is Lanyon acknowledging, some acknowledgement that not everything can be explained in objective terms, and some things, they just feel real to us, and there is no kind of shared language with which to communicate it. It's kind of inexplicable. These feelings are inexplicable, can't be put into words. So some acknowledgement that some phenomenon don't have a name for them, they can't be pinpointed. Some things in this world are ultimately impalpable, unknowable. But we have another character, on whom Hyde has this effect, this universal disturbance in people. So it's just a feeling, and the characters are putting forward the idea that they just have a feeling their blood runs cold or whatever else. There's no medical reason as to why that would be happening. There's no scientific reason as to why that would be happening. But the fact that everybody feels it suggests it must be real, suggests that he must have some kind of supernatural power, some kind of supernatural effect on people. So we become confused as readers as to what's real and what's just imagined. Again, that's very central to the Gothic genre, it being harder to distinguish between what's imaginary, what's real, what do we believe is supernatural. And also it's very conventional of the Gothic genre to have the supernatural enter everyday reality, which is very much what is happening here. This bore some resemblance to incipient rigour and was accompanied by a marked sinking of the pulse. He's trying to explain what he's feeling, again, in clinical and medical terms, but he can't quite pinpoint it, hence why he's saying this bore some resemblance. He's trying to give a kind of clinical diagnosis of how Hyde makes him feel, but you can't fully account for it in medical terms. At the time, I set it down to some idiosyncratic personal distaste. So he just thought, oh, it's just me. I just really don't take to this guy. I merely wondered at the acuteness of the symptoms. But I have since had reason to believe the cause to lie much deeper in the nature of the man, and to turn on some nobler hinge than the principle of hatred. This person, who had thus from the first moment of his entrance struck in me what I can only describe as a disgustful curiosity, was dressed in a fashion that would have made an ordinary person laughable. His clothes, that is to say, although they were of a rich and sober fabric, were enormously too large for him in every measurement. His clothes being of a rich and sober fabric, that could potentially link to Jekyll's outwardly, on a surface level, ostensibly him having a very pleasant and respectable outward appearance to people. So his personality on a superficial level is very impressive. However, the fact that these clothes are enormously too large for him, I mentioned this before when we talked about Hyde being on the floor, the clothes not fitting him. It could be to do with the idea that often how we represent ourselves outwardly, our public personas, are not fitting, literally not fitting with who we are on the inside, and hence these clothes being too large for Hyde. The trousers hanging on his legs and rolled up to keep them from the ground, the waist of the coat below his haunches, and the collar sprawling wide upon his shoulders. Strange to relate, this ludicrous accoutrement was far from having me to laughter. Rather, as there was something abnormal and misbegotten in every essence of the creature that now faced me. So abnormal obviously means he's not normal. That's been reinforced all the way throughout the novella, because he's abnormal, because how can this being in front of me possibly be human, given his behaviour, given his appearance? Remember as well, so we talked about the development of that new pseudoscience physiognomy. Physiognomy said that often people's outward appearances would reflect their inner personality, so hence why Hyde outwardly looks so abnormal, looks so ugly, because that's who he is as a person. He's an ugly person. Misbegotten, that word means poorly conceived, so not made quite right. So it's as if this is a human being gone wrong here. Humans are supposed to be a certain way, to fit a certain mould, which Hyde does not. Precisely because he represents all the aspects of human nature that don't sit well with us, that aren't in the image of God. The essence of the creature. Now, a creature is something that's created. So there's a heavy hint there at his the idea of him being unhuman or supernatural. That now faced me. Something seizing, surprising, and revolting. He's used the power of three there to really emphasise his distaste towards Hyde. This fresh disparity seemed but to fit in and to reinforce it, so that to my interest in the man's nature and character, there was added a curiosity as to his origin, his life, his fortune, and status in the world. These observations, though they have taken so great a space to be set down in, were yet the work of a few seconds. My visitor was indeed on fire with sombre excitement. So on fire suggests that he is out of control, he poses a certain danger. Sombre means dark. It's quite oxymoronic, sombre excitement, but potentially because Hyde takes excitement and enjoyment in things that are perceived to be dark, so things that are perceived to be evil. Have you got it, he cried. Have you got it? His repetition, the fact that verb crying, he is the opposite of behaving in the opposite way in which a Victorian gentleman ought to be behaving in this type of situation, meeting a new person. He is using direct address and not using any kind of formal, polite address. So he's not calling Lanyon sir, he's not referring to him by name. He's being very unrestrained in his behaviour, very impolite, showing no etiquette, which is very at odds with how Lanyon goes on to behave in spite of his rudeness. And so lively was his impatience that he even laid his hand upon my arm and sought to shake me. I put him back, conscious at his touch of a certain icy pang along my blood. Come, sir, said I. So there, his politeness, come, sir, juxtaposes with Hyde's rudeness and impatience. You forget that I have not yet the pleasure of your acquaintance. Be seated, if you so please. So he's almost overly polite, in direct juxtaposition with how Hyde's behaving now makes Hyde look even worse. But then, by the same token, Lanyon's talking to him really politely, putting on a real display of perfect etiquette, but don't forget he's got a gun in his hand that he's prepared to use. So again, that's showing you hypocrisy, underhandedness of Victorian gentlemen and their behaviours. And I showed him an example, and sat down myself in my customary seat with as fair an imitation of my ordinary manner to a patient as the lateness of the hour, the nature of my preoccupations, and the horror I had of my visitor would suffer me to muster. So he's still trying to put on an ordinary manner, which shows you how hard and to what extremes the Victorian gentleman will go to keep up appearances and keep up an image of order and decorum. I beg your pardon, Dr. Lanyon, he replied civilly enough, so he's switched up now. But then what that suggests then, if Hyde can switch up when needs be, when it's in his interest, that again hints at man's dual nature. He can be civil if he wants to be, if it's in his best interest, just as Victorian gentlemen will behave in a civil manner only so far as it's in their interest, and will drop that civility again when it's in their interest. And what that shows as well as that being polite is not a natural behaviour. Being polite is something that can be put on. It's a facade that can be put on at will. And it is a lot of the time by Victorian gentlemen. Their shows of politeness, of kindness, are largely false.